Everyone struggles with these feelings of, I'm not good enough. You probably think that you're the only one, or that it's only a few people. I have been practicing psychiatric care for over 20 years, and I can tell you that most people that I take through the Mentally Strong method, one of their core connections is, I'm not good enough. Where does that come from? Many professionals will talk about that it comes from trauma. Feeling I'm not good enough comes from trauma. Now, you might be thinking, I have not experienced trauma, or maybe you've experienced lots of trauma. So what is trauma? Trauma is something that changes your perception of the world, your reality. So let's talk about what we call big T trauma in psychiatry. Big T trauma is you were physically or sexually abused, and it was clear that that event changed the way you thought about yourself. But then trauma is a continuum. And we often say big T trauma and little t trauma, not to quantify it, but to just bring awareness that anything that changes your perception of the world can be defined as trauma because it changes. So my name's Christy Bundakumar. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and I'm an expert in traumatic grief. We don't often think about grief as trauma, but think about it for a minute. Somebody who was there, consistent for you, you loved, and then they're gone. Does that change your perception, your reality, your awareness of safety? Yes. In my case, I've actually lost 3 children and my husband. My son, Johnny, died in 2005 and in a drowning accident. So completely healthy child, boom, gone. And that changed my reality. Did I know it was trauma then? No. And in reality, we also don't identify a lot of things from our childhood as trauma. And maybe we don't call it trauma. And many times I have been reluctant to call things trauma. After my daughter died in 2021, I stood before my staff and said, I don't have trauma. And Maya was the 3rd child that I lost. And so calling it trauma was a revelation for me as I was going through my own grief work. But let's go back to the definition of trauma, or how I'm defining trauma here. As we go through life, right? You're an infant, then you're a toddler, and then you're a young child, and then an older child, and then a teenager. And as you are experiencing life, and life is coming at you, your perception of reality slightly changes with every experience. And when an experience is negative, it can kind of shift you in a negative. So back to what I said in the very beginning, that everyone has this not good enough. And I clearly have it, as I've worked through what I call the Mentally Strong method for many years. I'm not good enough is a core connection that often comes up for me. And I have compensated by getting degrees and helping people and doing things. And maybe if I just do and accomplish enough, I will be good enough. Now, I know that now, and so I work on that, and I try to continue to be productive and not in the form of trying to negate that, right? We need to believe that we are enough by ourselves. But when we started, I said that everyone has this. And definitely all the women that I have done a thought map on, and many of the men, they have this core belief that they're not good enough. No matter what they do, they're somehow defective. And if we could get in and shift that and change that. When you talk to a professional about trauma work, there's lots of techniques that help move trauma out of the body. I always start with what I call the Mentally Strong method. This is how I have gotten through my hardships. I told you about my son Johnny, who died in 2005 in a drowning accident. Shortly after that, my son Reggie started having catastrophic epilepsy, and he had 10 years of medical trauma before his death in 2016. And in the midst of that, I was raising 6 kids and dealing with Reggie's medical trauma. And I had to learn how to think through my problems, organize them, and make choices in line with what I want. And this is what I can teach you, right? Do you think that you're not good enough? How often, how much energy are you using thinking those things? When I take you through the Mentally Strong method, I help you think through, which you probably know how to think, but you might be thinking so much, we call that overthinking or ruminating. And when that is in negative thought, you're not only taking energy, but it is very difficult to think positive. All of the self-help books will talk about just think positive and positive things will happen. Research actually shows if you could stop thinking negative, that is more powerful than positive. Because for every negative thought, you have to have 10 to 20 positive thoughts to negate that negative thought. But if you don't know where it's coming from, it's very hard to get rid of it. So in the Mentally Strong method, we help you organize those things. So let's say you know that you struggle with I'm not good enough. I'll let you put that in the core connections right away. I call it core connections because it's like these internal buttons in your body that when something happens, it triggers an emotional response, it triggers that thought. Some people call it your inner child. Some people call it core belief systems, but it's internal dialogue that only you can shift and change. So in the Mentally Strong method, we teach you to think more efficiently and then organize. So you can have this core connections box and you can put I'm not good enough in there. But then we're going to talk about what is your grief? What is your trauma? What kind of anxieties do you have? Is there spiritual conflict? Injustices? And we're going to put these in different categories because they are dealt with differently. I'm an expert in traumatic grief. Obviously, because I've lost 3 children and my husband, I've worked through it. I'm continuing to work through it, and I'm teaching as I'm working through it. But I also have a psychiatry degree that allows me to see it from a science perspective. And if I were to be completely honest with you right now, the biggest struggles in my healing come from these core beliefs, core connections that started in childhood. But I say to you, I didn't have that bad of a childhood, right? Like my mom did her best. I had a loving mother, a loving grandmother. We didn't have much money, but there was definitely love. No known trauma. So why would I think I'm not good enough? Well, my mom probably thought she wasn't good enough. And everyone tells me I'm just like my mom, right? So even these little subtle things changes my perception. So is that really trauma? No, I don't like to identify those things as trauma because it puts everything as trauma and puts everything out as a blame. That's not what this is about. It's about identifying where it comes from so that you can get rid of it, so that you can fix that mentality. I work through a grief intensive with people. You come to my center, you stay a week, we do intensive grief work, and we peel these things apart. What is trauma? What is grief? Because when you have experienced grief, that pain is to be cherished, right? You've lost this loved one. But when it's enmeshed with your trauma, with your negative thinking, with your core beliefs, you're holding on to negative. And that's what I do. I teach people how to unravel these things. Click on the link below. You can learn more about the grief intensive. That is kind of my specialty. But regardless of what you are struggling with, if you think that you are not good enough, there's something that you can do about it. Right? You can learn to think through those things without overthinking, without ruminating, and organize them. And you likely do have some trauma, and maybe it's micro trauma, right? But these things in your childhood that changed your perception of yourself. So you don't believe in the beauty and the purpose of you and your soul on this earth. If you follow my story, you know that after losing my children, I have extreme spiritual conflict. Like, how could a God that loves me and protects me do this to me? Those things are important to work out. Spiritual conflict is real, whether you believe in a singular God or not. I inspire you to work on your spiritual health as you work on your mental health. So I have a few questions that came from the audience specifically around this I'm not good enough. My parents did their best, and I don't think it's trauma. How do I work through this I'm not good enough? Well, I gave a little example of myself, and I would never blame my mother, and I don't want you to blame your mother. It is not about blame. Even if there's like significant trauma and you need to work through that and forgive and let go, it's about what it did to you. Where did it come from? So if you think about this thought of I'm not good enough, I want you to think of the earliest age that you thought that. And for me, it was around 9 or 10 that I can remember. Maybe it was earlier. I was in trouble for something, but it wasn't just about the consequences of my behavior. I took it personally, like I'm not good enough. My parents didn't do anything wrong. I deserved to be punished at that time, but now I can identify that and shift the perspective. Like none of us are perfect, but we are good enough, right? So it is not about blame. I want you to just kind of think through where this came from. And I do what's called a thought map, and you can look at some of my other videos about this, but we'll start with a central thought, and we'll say, what makes us feel like this now? What's made me feel like this in the past? What made me feel like this in my childhood? And how does this impact my spiritual relationship? And we start putting all these bubbles all over the place. And then you stop and you look at it and you begin to see patterns. So this is what I'm saying when, learning to think. How do we efficiently think so that we can organize those things and make choices in line with what we want? Who do you want to be? Do you want to be that person who is confident in their journey and their purpose? It's just learning that process. It's not about blame. This is another one. I come from a loving family, and I still struggle with I'm not good enough. How do I make sure that my children don't struggle with that? Whew, big one. You will make mistakes in raising your children. When I teach about children, relationships are a priority. You put your relationship with your child as the priority. And when you have to punish them, or when you have to criticize them, or when they're upset, think about it as a whole, as they are a whole person and you are influencing them. You cannot control your child, but you can influence them, right? And we influence them with positive reinforcement or punishment, however you run your family, hopefully a combination of both, right? But if you can do it in relationship and you can talk about it, you're on this punishment, the energy of the situation has come down the next day. Let's kind of talk about how does it make you feel when you are criticized? I want you to know that you are loved, that you are good enough, but these are things that we want to see out of you, and really explain why we want to see those things out of our children. I am 100% guilty of raising my children of do what I say because I said so, which is not as good as if we could take that extra time and do the relationship piece of that and really kind of talk about why. And I always resemble it to the world. Yes, I am the parent, I'm in this household, I am the authority. You will have authority everywhere in your life. When you try to get a job, the government is the authority. We have rules. And if we can attach those rules to values, that helps a child understand. But also just broadening their understanding of reward and punishment so that it's not always internalized. It will change their perception. But relationships, if you make relationship a priority, it will trump any negative thing that you might accidentally do. They are these little sponges, and there will be things that you do that cause a negative impact. I often see on the other side someone who was highly criticized as a child and became a perfectionist and still doesn't think they're good enough. They spoil their child and give their child everything that they want, and then there's no formative internal drive and discipline, right? So it's a balance. And when I taught the Raising Mentally Strong Kids class, and this is me and my children. I have 5 of my children are adopted, 2 biological. And 2 of my adopted children really gave me a run for their money in their teenage years. And I used to describe this like tug of war that I would do with my teens, right? Give them a little, nope, pull it back, give them. And this very wise counselor said to me once, don't think of it as tug of war, think of it as a dance. And you are dancing with your children, and you are doing your best to lead them and not step on their toes, but guide them to a healthy adulthood. So I hope that helps. Last question. I'm embarrassed to admit that I am in an abusive relationship. Part of me knows that I don't deserve it and I should leave, but honestly, I don't think I'm good enough. I think he's the best that I can have, and I want to be in a relationship. I don't know this person personally, but I just want to say to you, if you are in an abusive relationship, whether it's verbally, emotionally, and especially physically abusive, I know you think everyone is going to just tell you, you have to leave, you have to leave. And that causes resistance because you are afraid. You are afraid that you are not good enough. You are afraid that you're not going to be able to do this on your own. You are afraid that your love for that person will bring you back. These are very complicated relationships, and I cannot imagine giving you advice not knowing you. But one thing I do know is that if you work on yourself internally, what you should do will come to light for you. So what I teach in the Mentally Strong Method is we would do that thought map that I talked about, and then we would organize all of these things. Oftentimes people get into these relationships resembling a relationship in their childhood. Things that are being said to you were probably said to you in your childhood, and it's kind of reinforcing what you already believe about yourself. So my encouragement to you is to begin to believe in yourself, begin to take away those negative thoughts. Just take them away. Just work on yourself and begin to develop a personal vision of who you want to be, where you want to be. And then I think what you need to do will come to the surface for you. Thank you so much for those questions and for you continuing to listen. If you want to keep listening, go to How to Release Trapped Emotions, right? All this trauma is also trapped emotions. And if you're interested in the Grief Intensive, click on the link below. I hope to see you there.